In October, Stanley Kunitz became the 10th Poet Laureate of the United States. At the age of 95, his poetry is constantly evolving, and many critics insist his voice has only gotten stronger with time. His long-esteemed career began at the age of 25 when he published his first book of poetry. In 1959, after being rejected by 8 publishers, he won the Pulitzer Prize for Selected Poems, 1928-1958. His poems are meditations on time and existence affected by the prenatal loss of his father. Part of his initiative as Poet Laureate is to improve the way poetry is being taught in public schools. He stresses that poetry needs to be open to new sources of inspiration. He has recently released his 12th volume of poetry, The Collected Poems. I am pleased to have him here on this program. Here it is, The Collected Poems. What about this painting on the
That's
cover?
done by my wife.
This is by your wife?
Yes. The painter, Elise Asher.
Oh, terrific.
Yes.
When did she paint that?
In the 80s.
In the 80s.
Yes, I
Very
think.
nice.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of cultural talent in this family, huh?
Yeah, it's based on one of my poems.
Which
called
one?
The Long Boat.
The Long Boat.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
You did a whole series.
You said something that I found fascinating. You said that at your age, you want to write poems that are natural, luminous, deep, spare. A dream of art so transparent that you can look through and see the world.
It's a great ambition, if I could fulfill it.
What did you feel, what did you think when you were nominated to be the Poet Laureate?
Well, I have a line from one of my poems that came to me, and the line reads, "We are what we are, and only life surprises."
Very good. We are what we are,
and only life surprises.
So life surprised you?
It did.
Poetry for you. You believe, and you said language is the greatest of all human achievements, and one could argue that poetry is a supreme level of language. Any doubt for you that it is the supreme level of language?
I believe so, yes.
Why?
I think it goes back into the very origins of the human species. The first language came out of sounds associated with dance and ritual. And as Wallace Stevens said, in poetry, words are above all sounds. And I would add to that that these sounds are caught, are surprised in the act of changing into meaning.
Who's your favorite poet?
Oh, that's a hard question. The poets who have influenced me are, of course, the ones who are closest. But that doesn't mean I think they're necessarily the greatest. But they're the ones who touched me.
Who?
Above all, I would say that John Keats and Gerard Manley Hopkins are the two who stirred me into poetry.
What was it they did or
well,
said
there was
wrote?
Keats made out of his short life a poem in itself. And I remember when I was a student in college reading his letters after I had read his poems, and I came across a phrase that made me sit up. That phrase was, "The holiness of the heart's affections." And I think that that little phrase has done as much as anything else to keep the concept of poetry alive in me.
And Hopkins?
And Hopkins, I discovered while roaming through the stacks in the Widener Library at Harvard when I was still an undergraduate. And I reached into the stacks, and a book came out and fell on the floor. I picked it up, and it turned out to be the first edition of Hopkins' poems, introduced by Robert Bridges, published in 1918. It had never been out of the library. Nobody had ever read it. And I sat down and I opened it. And the first poem I came across was God's Grandeur. And it just swept me away. There was something about its internal rhythms, something about its spiritual energy that moved me as nothing had done before. And I thought, if only I could ever write something, even approaching this, I would die happy.
Did you know then that what you wanted to do was to write poetry?
I had glimmers of it. I knew I was going to be a writer. And I gradually became aware that poetry, above all, was the form of writing that I wanted to make the center of my life and of my energies.
How do you think your style has evolved?
It has gone through many stages. I started very much under the influence of the English metaphysical poets.
Blake.
Donne and Herbert first. And I was taken by their involvement with great questions about the meaning of existence, about the relationship between time and eternity. And I wrote very much in their style, quite formal, stanzaic patterns, tight poems, very dense in their imagery and compactness. And as the years have passed, I have moved, as your quote from me indicates, to a more simple, a more
clear, free verse style.
Yes, well, it is not necessarily free verse. There's underlying, but there's a song hidden in every poem. And the search of the poem is for the words to fit the song.
Critics say you've gotten better with time. Not always true about creative arts.
Not always, no.
You know, some say that some of Mozart's work was best when he was younger, than even though he died very young. They've said that about other artists, that their best creations came as young men and women. But you seem to have gotten better. Do you believe that? Do you feel more in command? And
yes, I think, but it's harder. It's harder to write poems in one's age than in one's youth.
Why?
Well, in one's early years, one's glands do the writing for you. And it all is delivered to you every day. It seems to be an inexhaustible fountain. At my age, certainly, poems are more difficult to write. For one thing, one has written so much, one has explored all one's ready themes. One doesn't want to keep repeating oneself, going back to the same fountain to drink. One wants to write poems that are new to you as well as to others. And the only way it can be done is to dig deeper and deeper into oneself, under the debris of the life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's hard. That's hard. It's difficult, sometimes very painful.
Has it been painful for you?
It's been painful and joyous, both.
Do we appreciate poetry in America too little?
I would agree. I think that as a nation, we have not explored the meaning of poetry. We have not made it part of the fabric of our national life. I think most poets feel that their art is considered to be somewhat peripheral, and they themselves are marginal. And part of the reason is that we don't have in our heritage an early exploration of a mythic beginning, as some of the other great cultures have had. We borrowed our poetry as we did our nationhood from Mother England. And what we inherited in the 18th century was heroic couplets and hymns. So that the search for a grand mythic source has not been part of the creative imagination.
Some write that they think that your poetry is dominated by themes of nature and
Mm-hmm.
the fragile quality
Mm-hmm.
of life. Do you accept that?
Well, nature is certainly an important source to me. It's part of my daily life.
You're a big-time gardener.
I'm a gardener, and I have been a farmer, and the natural world is, to me, a source of labor, intensive labor, and a participation in the whole ritual of birth and growth and death and even resurrection.
Mm.
So there is a sense that one is going through each year in the garden a ceremony of existence itself.
How does religion influence you?
I am at my center, a religious person, but I am not an observant participant in organized religion. I have read in all the religions. I have listened to the prophets, and I have read the good books. And I know that I have religious yearnings, but I am not a daily observer of religious practice.
But are you a believer?
I am a believer in the energy and value of the Spirit, but I have no deep conviction about the Godhead, if there is one. I'm willing to be persuaded, but I'm not ready yet to say yes.
What was the impact of the suicide of your father?
It was a great impact. The suicide occurred a few weeks before I was born, so I never encountered my father. But he has been a presence and somebody who in spirit I turn to in times of tragedy or desolation. And he's a presence in my poems.
But it took you a long time to write about it.
It took me a long time before I was able to cope with the reality.
Was it the means of dying, or was it the fact that...
Well, it was partly the sense that he had forsaken me.
I was going to say abandonment.
Before I had even emerged. And I couldn't help as a child but to wonder whether my impending arrival had something to do with his self-destruction.
Have you come to some closure on that for yourself?
I think so, yes. And I think the poems that I have written about that occurrence have helped me to deal with it.
Let me close with having you read from Leaves, one of your collected poems. I mentioned once again that you won the Pulitzer Prize. What year was it that you won? For 58, was it?
58.
You're going to read from Leaves.
No, The Layers.
The Layers, I'm sorry.
The Layers. I'm going to read from.
You'll read from The Layers.
I have walked through many lives, some of them my own, and I am not who I was, though some principle of being abides, from which I struggle not to stray. When I look behind, as I am compelled to look before I can gather strength to proceed on my journey, I see the milestones dwindling toward the horizon and the slow fires trailing from the abandoned campsites over which scavenger angels wheel on heavy wings. Oh, I have made myself a tribe out of my true affections, and my tribe is scattered. How shall a heart be reconciled to its feast of losses? In a rising wind, the manic dust of my friends, those who fell along the way, bitterly stings my face. Yet I turn, exulting somewhat, with my will intact to go wherever I need to go, and every stone on the road precious to me. In my darkest night, when the moon was covered and I roamed through wreckage, a nimbus-clouded voice directed me. Live in the layers, not on the litter. Though I lack the art to decipher it, no doubt the next chapter in my book of transformations is already written. I am not done with my changes.
Thank you, Stanley. Thank you very much. Stanley Kunitz, the Poet Laureate of the United States. This, the collected poems. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.